Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video with Mr. Terry as I continue my search for historical knowledge here on the internet. Alright, today's video is The Problem with Africa's Border by a channel called Atlas Pro, which I have not watched yet, but I see it's very popular. And just looking kind of through their things, it looks like they focus again on a lot of geography, which is awesome. I love geography. It goes hand in hand with history, and I love it even just from the non-historical elements of geography. So I'm really interested in this. I'm also very interested in Africa, especially when it comes to borders and imperialism and colonization. It's a big part of world history. And when I saw the title of this, The Problem with Africa's Borders, it brought a lot of things just to my mind right away, specifically like the scramble for Africa in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where European nations came in and colonized virtually the entire continent. And we know a big problem that came with that was they established borders not based off of local traditions or local customs, cultures, and things like that, but more for the purposes of European nations agreeing upon borders so they don't have border disputes. And that has been a big thing that has hurt Africa, especially in the post-colonial era, because those borders are intact but don't make a lot of local cultural sense, which has given way to all kinds of different political and social issues in Africa. So I'm interested to see what they have here. I think this could go a lot of ways, but I hope to learn a lot, and I'll try to share anything I can with you as well. If you like this original video, go down to the description and make sure you give them a like and subscribe. Love to have you as a sub on my channel as well and be a part of our community. So be sure to hit that sub button, enable notifications for the live streams, and let's go ahead and get started.
When the Europeans colonized Africa, they cared about one thing above all else: profit. Whether it was gold from Guinea, rubber from the Congo, or diamonds from South Africa, the goal was to extract resources and send them back home.
It's important to understand for this the economic motivations for specific parts of Africa. Like I said in the intro, Africa gets colonized by virtually every part of it gets colonized, virtually, except for Ethiopia and Liberia. But knowing these specific natural resources, because by natural resource instruction, it's really important for you to understand that.
About one thing above all else: profit. Whether it was gold from Guinea.
Now, this region too also used to be the big region where the Europeans would do this, conduct a slave trade, right? And by the late 1800s, the European slave trade had ended, so it now came to more of natural resource acquisition, especially in these other places.
Rubber from the Congo.
Rubber is really important because rubber is a necessary component of the Industrial Revolution. This colonial era goes hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, and rubber components were something that made the machinery of the Industrial Revolution possible, and places like the Congo were full of that.
Or diamonds from South Africa, the goal was to extract resources and send them back home. This focus on profitability led the European powers to hold the Berlin Conference, where Africa was divided between new and old colonial powers diplomatically to avoid any conflict between Europeans. After all, conflicts cost money, which, at the end of the day, threatened the profitability of the colonies.
Sure.
What wasn't taken into account were the divisions among the Africans themselves.
Yeah.
What this resulted in was
they didn't mention it. The Berlin Conference was basically a European conference held by leaders to discuss Africa's basically the borders and to settle what the rules would be for colonization. Now, there's a couple key parts of the Berlin Conference that you're going to want to understand. One is they set up the rules sort of for it, and basically they said as a European nation could claim could claim whatever unclaimed territory. Now, what that means though is unclaimed by other Europeans. Doesn't matter if there are African states there. That was kind of the rule, that then you could do that. Another important component of the Berlin Conference, though, is that no African nations were actually represented at that conference to speak on their behalf. It was not on the agenda, or even they didn't want the opinion of the African leaders.
Cohesive nations like the Maasai being divided between English Kenya and German East Africa, what later became Tanzania. And the bigger the nation was, the more divided it often became. The Yoruba nation, for example, with a population today of 44 million people, were split between English Nigeria, French West Africa, German Togoland, and the English Gold Coast.
You can see how this is going to be a disaster when, I mean, the colonial nations can keep the people together in a way, keep it a functioning nation, but it's again, when these nations leave and they stick with these borders, you saw that. How do you get any kind of cultural unity in a nation? How can you get people on board with political decisions, any kind of cultural decisions? You have this much diversity. People do not understand often how diverse Africa actually is. And yeah, the borders that are there today do not represent African culture.
Directly north, the Hausa nation, with a population of 75 million today, were divided in half by English Nigeria and French West Africa, what eventually became Niger, both of which were partially included within the borders of modern-day Nigeria, alongside the Igbo, another tribe of around 49 million people whose traditional lands lie in...
Well, look what this is going to do, okay? When they're eventually independent, people like to vote for their people that represent their culture. Like, okay, you're going to have a democracy. Like, all right, you're going to be a democracy. Think of how many different political parties you're going to have just based off these ethnic differences. People, someone that represents the Hausa and the Yoruba, the Igbo, and then try to have a a voting, process. You're going to have so many different people. Somebody's going to win, but with like 20%, 15%, you know what I mean? It's not going to be, you're never going to get a majority vote. It's going to be a difficult thing.
Entirely within the country's borders. And that's not to mention all the smaller tribes crammed in between them, often leading to intense competition over the lands collectively deemed as theirs. For some perspective, Spain today has nearly the same population as the Yoruba. France has slightly fewer people than the Hausa, and the Igbo have a population greater than Portugal, Belgium, and the Netherlands combined. So imagine someone coming into...
But you don't even know about them because they don't have a nation. They're not called, there's no nation of the Yoruba, you know what I mean? So you just think of, oh, they're Nigerians, but that term doesn't really mean anything.
Europe, drawing a country that included only half of Spain, half of France, and also all those other guys. That is a simplified version of what Nigeria and many, many other African nations are. In the worst cases, these borders created a mess of civil wars, revolutions, and genocides within and between many African nations as the people tried to better align their countries to their nations. These events serve as reminders of just how impactful lines on a map can be. But the great thing about borders and what this whole disaster proves is that borders are just that, lines on a map that can be changed.
Can be changed, but yeah, but when those European nations left, a lot of those what are going to be now independent nations agreed to actually keep their borders. A lot of them did that when maybe it would have been better to form their own, but it didn't matter anyways, because at the beginning of the video he talked about how the whole colonial era was meant to benefit the European host nations, right? The manufacturing, the manufacturing is all in Europe and things like that. The job creation that way. There is no infrastructure or local government buildup there. So when the Europeans leave, they leave those people with nothing. And the one thing they do have, I guess, is the previous borders, at least something to build upon. But you'd have to completely reform the nation from the ground up because they start with nothing when their independence is gained.
So if we know the borders don't work for Africa, we have to ask, can the borders of Africa be fixed?
Sure. Good question. Is their actual intro? Cool.
Okay, so first I'd like to take a look at this map, published by Harvard University in 1959.
Look at that. I mean, first off, you could never make nations based off of this. There is nowhere close to being enough resources to do that, but it shows the tribal difference. I guess the idea would be, I don't know, could you form them, you get a bunch of tribes and make them, but make sure the whole tribe is enveloped in a nation? Is that like the best thing you do? Because you could not make this many independent nations. There's no way. You wouldn't have any functionality.
What's shown is the approximate territorial boundaries of various tribes and nations found within the continent. Looking at this, we can see the boundaries are by no means uniform. Where it's hard to live, like the Sahara, the territories are large and sparsely populated, with some even being labeled as uninhabited. Where the natural conditions become more favorable, like West Africa and the Lakes region, we can see an explosion in ethnodiversity and the map becomes crowded. Using these borders but now plotting conflicts across the continent, we can see a problem.
Let's take a look at this real quick. So conflicts. All right, so we got them in the more densely populated areas, resource-rich places. Look at like Liberia, which is interesting because they actually had independence. Liberia's story is interesting because they did not get colonized. They were a protector of the United States. A lot of that in big part too. After slavery is ended in the United States, there was a group of African Americans, freed African Americans, that ended up moving to Africa. And a lot of them went to Liberia. Ethiopia is the other one. Ethiopia is the fascinating story because that was the only one that was able to militarily defend themselves. King Menelik and the Ethiopians defended themselves against the Italians and were the only ones militarily able to defend themselves and keep their independence. At least in this era. Eventually, Italians come back in between World Wars I and II and do take it.
Ethnic diversity in Africa appears to be linked to conflict. This map reminds me a lot of maps of the Holy Roman Empire, with all of its many small and intricate tribes, or in this case kingdoms, fighting each other until, well, there was nothing really left to fight about.
That was the big criticism of the Holy Roman Empire, right? It wasn't really an empire. It was a bunch of basically autonomous states, and it was all Holy Roman Empire in name only, right?
That's why giving each and every tribe and nation in Africa their own country likely wouldn't work. And that's what makes drawing borders in Africa so difficult.
Yeah, I agree.
But just like how the many smaller kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire eventually unified to form Germany, these tribal boundaries can be used as the building blocks for larger, more stable nations.
Sure.
What these true nations of Africa look like, however, depend on your definition of a nation. For Germany, forming a nation meant unification through a common religion, language, and ancestral descent.
So that is something you're going to have to take into account because Africa is religiously diverse. Yes, you have Christian groups and then you have Islamic groups predominantly, but there are other ones. So, but then it also gets tricky too because if you do it just on religion, those borders may not make sense on that front too. So like, do you blend? You have to find some kind of like common ground between maybe like forming boundaries based on religious things, but then also in tribal. It's hard. Like, I don't know how you do this.
Where the people practiced Catholicism or spoke French or were Italians, well, those became different countries. So by using these three factors, religion, language, and ancestry, we can start working on a framework for what the true unified nations of Africa would look like.
Okay,
Perhaps the clearest dividing line within Africa's population is religion, which is why I made it first.
But that's interesting too. Look how many what do they call them? Enclaves? Conclave? What's it called? The term when you have like in like Lesotho and Swaziland and stuff, like these places where you have a group that's like just set in the middle of another nation. I forgot the term for that, but Africa has a lot of that. You can see them dotted in there, which makes infrastructure difficult.
Africa is a land rich with its own native beliefs. Two major religions, Christianity and Islam, have come to play overarching roles across nearly the entire continent, dividing Africa into a majority Islam north and a majority Christian south. This Islamic influence in the north is the result of expansions by several different caliphates and empires over the centuries, connecting North Africa religiously and therefore culturally with their neighbors in the Middle East and Mediterranean.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, Islam has been in Africa far longer than Christianity. Yeah, there's like Axum and some of the little tiny Christian group that comes out very early on in the first millennium, but predominantly Islamic as they came in, conquered, and established trading routes across the Sahara.
Europe. Though the same could be said in part for Christianity.
That's Axum, by the way. Axum is in Ethiopia, is the oldest, basically the oldest Christian community in Africa. They developed really interesting in Ethiopia. They developed totally independent from the Catholic and Orthodox churches, basically developing over centuries their own little brand of Christianity. Really cool, but yeah, one of the cool features there is they got those they built into the cliffs in the ground there churches. That's a church down there. Really cool.
Places like
Axum,
Ethiopia,
A-X-U-M.
before Islam even existed, Christianity as a whole saw its greatest advance through the later missionary work done during colonization. Estimates place Africa's Christian population at around 630 million followers, beating out Latin America to become the home to the largest Christian population anywhere on Earth. That being said, until recently, Islam was even more prevalent, making up 45% of Africa's population, compared to only 40% encompassed by Christianity back in the early 2000s. Since then, however, the Christian countries of Africa have experienced a far more significant boom in population, increasing their total number of followers, resulting in the two religions having nearly the exact same number of followers on the continent today, leaving a Muslim Africa which covers around 15 million square kilometers and a Christian Africa also covering around 15 million square kilometers.
Well, yeah, and you could never base a nation off that. Religious unity is not enough. You saw that in the early Islamic caliphates anyways. They tried to, like the Umayyad Caliphate, one of the earliest ones, they tried to organize basically a nation state as one that was governed with like an Islamic principles, like this is going to be an Islamic unified state, and then being Islamic will be enough to unify. That never worked. There's too many differences, right? There's too many cultural differences between something that vast. It doesn't work. Religion is not enough to just create a nation out of.
It's actually pretty remarkable just how evenly religion divides the continent. But of course, it's more complicated than this. Now, first, shout out to Islam for only having one major sect, Sunni Islam, found throughout. And shout out to Christianity for
Shia Islam is very it's a lot smaller. It's only about 15% of Islam and is almost solely in the Middle East.
Having 4, though only 3 really come into play here. Catholicism, Protestantism, and
I have a little issue with the term Protestantism, because all they're saying with Protestantism is not Catholic, and we all know Protestantism it's a very loose term about basically anything that's not Catholic or Orthodox or Greek Orthodox. So it's hard to say they're just Protestantism, because Protestants have all kinds of different beliefs. That's why there's so many Protestant churches, you know. But yeah, I mean, Protestantism is a thing, but it's not a religion.
And Ethiopian Orthodox. The fourth one is Coptic Orthodox, centered within Egypt, but they don't have a majority there, so we're really not going to talk about them. Looking at this, we can see it's not only tribal affiliations that divide African nations, but religious ones too. Seen clearly by looking at places like Nigeria or Ethiopia, where the split is roughly even.
Yeah, look at Ethiopia's diversity. Because you got like we were saying, the early Christianity, first 2-3 centuries of Christianity, they already had a community down there. So you got the African Christianity, and then man, look at that. You got Protestants. You got looks like a little thing of Catholicism in there. That would be the hardest country probably to unify right there, based off of the religious differences, or to create one out of that.
And then there's places like Mozambique, where not only do Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism occupy equal areas, but coexist with substantial traditional beliefs here as well. While there are only 2 major religions on the continent, Africa is home to over 2,000 different languages. What this means is that we can't look at each individual language, but instead we'll have to look at language families.
That you can do, because there are a lot of origin families, but language may be the most important thing there is for cultural unity, even more than religion. And Africa has, what they say, 1,000 languages. Like, that is so difficult to be able to deal with.
So, like how the Romance language family contains within it several related but distinct languages, the same can be said about all those found in Africa. Considered the most diverse in the world is the Niger-Congo language family, alone containing around 1,500 languages and covering nearly all of sub-Saharan Africa. With 700 million native speakers, this is the 3rd most spoken language family in the world, and because of it, I'd like to split it up a little more.
But, you saw, like, just because you're a language family does not mean you can communicate with each other. So the Romance, Spanish, Italian, when you get that going in French, they still can't communicate with each other. Like, that's not enough. That's such a broad term.
To do this, we can look at the languages only considered part of the Bantu subfamily, splitting the language family into its Niger and Congo or Bantu halves. I chose this because of the 700 million Niger-Congo speakers, around 350 million can be defined as Bantu, cutting this language family perfectly in half. The next biggest family on the continent is what's called the Afro-Asiatic language family. Like Islam, these are the languages that came to Africa through the involvement with their outside neighbors, which means the main language found throughout here is Arabic, with only 2 big exceptions.
A lot of it did blend, though. A lot of Arabic blended with local ones and created a blended language.
Deep in the heart of the Sahara, there is the Tuareg language, used by the nearly 3 million nomadic Amazigh who roam throughout this area today. And then, down around the Horn of Africa, there are the Cushitic languages, shared across Ethiopia and Somalia. Between these is the third and final major language family in Africa, Nilo-Saharan. Similar to the Niger-Congo family, Nilo-Saharan can be easily broken into two major groups. The Nilo part comes from the people living around the Nile River, with a couple small enclaves following the river all the way up to Egypt, while the other half branches out deep into the Sahara, more or less centered around Lake Chad. After the three major
or used to be, there's not much of a Lake Chad left anymore. Used to be way bigger.
Language families, we have two equally distinct but smaller families, both of which can be found at the bottom of the continent. First, there's the Khoisan language family, which is where you'll find the famous clicking consonants being used.
So fascinating. That's such a fascinating language. He's talking, but then you have those clicks. Unlike anything else, huh? It's so interesting.
Besides that, there isn't much connecting many of the individual languages within this family together, and the term Khoisan kind of works as a catch-all for a multitude of otherwise uncategorizable and unrelated groups in the area. Below them is where we'll find the Afrikaans language. Now, while many European languages are spoken across Africa, this is the only one that evolved into its own distinct language, deriving originally from Dutch. Spoken now by a majority of both people of African and of Dutch heritage here. What this shows is that as people move and spread, they bring their language with them, meaning race and language often go hand in hand with one another. And looking at a racial breakdown of the continent, we can see every linguistic family corresponds to a specific racial group as well.
They're really not bringing in though like the European languages there. I mean, English and French like are spoken widely in Africa, right? Because it was imposed, for so long. They're not really taking that into account too, though.
Which is why I'm not going to go much further into race other than to point out two significant groups not touched on by language. The first are the Chadic people, who occupy North Nigeria and southern Niger, essentially the Hausa I was talking about earlier. And second are the Banda people, both of which together serve to chop up the Niger-Congo language family even more. In summary, religion divides the continent into a clear North and South, Muslim and Christian Africa. Language creates anywhere between 6 to 9 domains, and finally with race we have a combination of the two. Using all three, we can begin to see what I'd like to call the big lines of Africa take form, which again define the theoretical limit of nations in Africa. What this means is that a country contained entirely within these lines likely has a better chance of establishing peace and stability than a country that crosses them. So, should these be the borders of Africa? Well, that's up for debate. To see why, we can look at a place like Sudan. You see, in 2010, the country of Sudan looked like this, even though religiously, linguistically, and racially it was clearly divided. Which is why the lines I created cut the modern country in two. And that's also why in 2011, South Sudan successfully separated itself from the North to become the youngest country in the world.
And that was very much on Christian and Islamic boundaries there. But then you see, I don't know if they'll get to it, but then South Sudan gets all these major problems too as a new nation. It wasn't enough just to split based off of those principles.
Which means that South Sudan can be seen as a test run for this concept of breaking apart Africa along these lines. The only problem is, with an ongoing civil war that began just 2 years after the country's formation and already several humanitarian crises underway, the early years of this new nation haven't been exactly easy. I mean, just look at how long the Wikipedia page for ethnic violence in South Sudan is.
Wow.
And I think this reveals something even more important about Africa. Despite a shared religion, a shared language, and a shared race, smaller ethnic groups within these still do not get along. And this is because borders aren't the only problem.
Sure.
Keeping with South Sudan.
So yeah, what is it going to be now? What are they going to get to it now?
And since its formation, the country has experienced a water crisis, a refugee crisis from a neighboring war, and a famine, which is a lot for any country to deal with all at once. So it doesn't really come as a surprise when the newer army...
Because you can't imagine the government was strong and managing resources. Remember, these places don't have any infrastructure. They didn't have any. They had to, before they could deal with infrastructure issues, they had to deal with just border issues, right? It's just adding up the checklist of things they need to do as a nation. Again, while doing that, while your people are starving, hard to get moving if you can't even get the survival aspect taken care of first.
The Army of South Sudan suggested to wipe out the entire Merle tribe on the face of the earth as the only solution to guarantee long-term security of newer cattle. What this reveals is that although conflicts are often fought along tribal lines, the causes of these conflicts often have more to do with resources than they do with the tribes themselves. What this has done is create a cycle in which scarcity leads to conflict, which creates more scarcity, leading to even more conflict.
Okay, so it looks like where they're going here with this is conflicts based off of resources, which I guess a lot of people you don't talk about. I mean, the most important commodity there is, I mean, it's survival, right? You got to have that. I mean, if you can't have that, you can't do anything. So yeah, resources, war for resources. So based off of that, more than any ethnic or religious divisions, is there's so many of us and there's so few resources, therefore conflict.
No matter what the borders of Africa are, this, or this, as long as people worry about their access to food and water and other basic essentials, regional conflicts within even the most balanced of African nations will occur. Sure. So while this serves as a tenuous framework for the creation of new states within the continent, that isn't the full picture.
There's no way. You see this, like, if this there's no way this could be a nation. There's so much diversity right there. I mean, maybe you could make it's just like I don't know how you do. I don't know how you make it work. I don't.
I think to end this, I'd just like to say that while Africa's borders haven't been friendly to many of the countries they define, that's not to say there haven't been some success stories to come out of them.
For sure.
And to break up these countries would likely be detrimental to the progress made since colonization. When European colonialism collapsed in Africa after the Second World War and control of Africa was handed over to Africans, the newfound leaders faced a decision: to keep the borders handed down to them and suffer through the conflicts between mismatched tribes, or to rearrange them and suffer through the new conflicts that arise. Damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Yeah.
In a move that echoed the Berlin Conference, African leaders made the collective decision to keep the arbitrary borders as they had been drawn by Europeans to preserve what little piece there was left in Africa after World War II.
That is maybe when you think about that's probably the biggest decision that's been made that has impacted things today, was the fact that the African nations decided to basically keep those borders and just try to deal with it. I guess if a change should have happened border-wise, it probably should have been back then. Right then, when they get independence, of, all right, let's reform everything. But trying to stick to it, maybe, I don't know if they didn't realize it'd be as divisive as it was, or it was simply just like, the most sensible decision that way, and it was the one with the least amount of problems, even though there's going to be. Probably what they're going for there.
And so far, this strategy has been working, and peace in Africa has been steadily increasing since the 70s. Looking at the Global Peace Index for 2019, we can see many African nations have climbed to rank among the most peaceful in the world, with 36, or exactly 2/3 of them, ranking more peaceful than the United States. And as Africa's recent population boom slows down and economic investment steadily increases, the continent...
That's the biggest thing that has to happen, is economic security. And you're seeing right now a big, far more investments. They definitely require foreign investments. They need the capital from other nations to come in and invest here without exploiting Africa. That's what has to happen, because otherwise you're just going to get more of what happened in the colonial era, which is the exploitation and not building up of infrastructure. For it to work, it has to benefit both the investor and the place that you're investing in. Otherwise, it'll just be more of the same forever. But if you get that economic stability and let them build wealth and security for themselves, finding that balance with your investors, then, I mean, that's the only way I could see. I mean, it's the only way Africa's going to grow at a fast rate.
It still has its brightest years ahead of it. Hey, I hope you enjoyed. I put a lot of research into this one and spent a few weeks just writing the script. So if you did enjoy and you'd like to support what I do here, you can check out my Patreon. Other than that, I'm wrapping up with school right now, so hopefully you guys will start to see more frequent uploads again. So subscribe if you haven't to see those. Thanks.
Awesome. This is fantastic. I love this. I love it when geography and history meet. Those are like my two academic passions, or when those meet, and they usually do. But when you can specifically put it together, it's just, I don't know. It inspires me to learn about it and be interested in it. So awesome. Yeah, they did exactly what I was hoping this video would be about, which is the territorial problems that relate to history, and trying to talk about the future in that way, and what hopefully is the best course of action for the strength of Africa. Because I mean, a strong, stable Africa helps the entire planet. With that, fewer conflicts in general in the world is better for it's better for everybody. But there's there's obviously not a perfect system for the borders of Africa. It's just, I mean, it's the cradle of civilization down there, and it's where humanity originates, and there's so much history there, that the longer the history is, the more diverse a place is going to be. And that's just the issue, I guess, with that. There's just so much diversity there, and so much has changed historically that, I don't know if there's a perfect system that you'll ever have in Africa. I mean, you can say that even in modern nations, right? And now that we live in a very globalized world where so many people are in different parts of the world, of having to try to figure out how do you create successful nation states, or to even question the role of nation states. Should we be looking at what the definition of nation states are, and how they should look in a modern sense, a modern globalized sense? Do we need to change our definitions and things like that? But all that's hard to do and hard to get consensus on. So maybe what he's saying is, the best that really Africa can do is try to find a balance between the tribal, linguistic, and religious sort of divisions. And that's the best you can do, right? It's never going to be perfect, but it's the best you could probably do there. So awesome. All right, this channel was great. Let me know if you liked this channel and would like to see more videos from them, and we will check out their playlist and see if we can learn more, and hopefully I can add some stuff to help out the video and help you guys out. And as we hopefully continue to build our little community with me and all of you watching, that we can go through and educate ourselves even better. All right, if you like this video, I know I did, I'll be subbing to them. Go down to the description and give them the like and sub. Love to have you as a sub as well. Hit that notification button as well, so you know when my live streams are. Other ways to support the channel too, like this channel, I also have a Patreon account, and that helps keep this channel running. One of the big perks of becoming a Patreon member is to vote in polls for videos that get here, starting at just $1 a month. But that's a way that you can really help the channel that way as well. All right, also, if you'd like to be part of our community, we have a great Discord community. You can join that and get involved with a lot of discussions of all kinds of historical themes. So I invite you to do that. Links to all that stuff is going to be down below in the description. All right, we'll go ahead and call it here. We'll see you next time. Bye.